Good day, nerds, and welcome to episode 33 of the Nerd Cantina Show. Today we have a Cantina conversation with three of the board members of TakeThis.org. They've recently released a white paper that discusses the state of the industry and some of the negative factors contributing to poor mental health of the developers and individuals inside the industry of video games. We have an in-depth and fascinating conversation, so stick around to hear about the factors affecting the industry that us nerds love.
Calling back all nerds. Nerds!
All right, well, good day, nerds, and thanks for joining us for what we hope is going to be a great conversation with the three members of TakeThis.org. And if you go back to episode 10, our first separate Cantina conversation we had with Dr. Rachel Kohrt, and as she was on, we had a great conversation with her, and it drove us to changing our format for the show as we felt our interviews were getting to a point that they deserved their own highlight separate from our ramblings on news and pop culture topics. And Dr. Rachel Kohrt, in that episode, she mentioned a white paper coming out about the state of the industry. And that white paper's come out. Steve and I have taken the time. We have read it. It is fascinating. It's very topical towards what's going on right now in the gaming industry. And we are proud to have three members of TakeThis.org to discuss their findings in the white paper. And we'll lead with a familiar voice. Dr. Kohrt, would you please remind everybody of who you are here?
Yes, of course. Thank you again for having me a second time. I am Dr. Rachel Kohrt. I am the research director of Take This, which is a nonprofit mental health organization that aims to destigmatize mental health challenges and also provide information and resources to the video game industry and video gaming communities. I am here joined by my two wonderful colleagues, the clinical director, Dr. B, and the executive director, Yves Crochet. And let's talk some science. I'm excited.
So this is Yves Crochet, the executive director of Take This, and I come to Take This from a long career in nonprofit work and as the wife of a small studio head in the game industry. So my credentials, and I'm really happy and excited to be here today.
And I'm Dr. Raphael Bakumatsu, or better known as Dr. B for now fairly plain reasons. Lots of double consonants in my name. Nobody really wants to say it. But I am a doctor of clinical psychology, and I tend to come from a more community clinician background. I'm a lifelong gamer. One of my most prized possessions is my still in possession 60 first issues of Nintendo Power. And
wow.
Just love serving gamers in the game industry.
Well, great. And again, thank you very much. We are really honored to have this opportunity. So just jumping right into the paper, and the paper begins, and you set the stage for really what is stress, what is kind of allostatic load, and the implications it has on both physical and mental health. And so that way the audience has an understanding on why this is so important. Could you please kind of bring that to light here?
Well, I'll since that was largely my section, I think.
Let's do it.
I think the stares I'm seeing on the video are my colleagues going, give it a start. So why it's important is because it builds. We would really like to think of some of the things we do, like sleep, as completely restorative, like they wipe the chalkboard clean and we can begin the day again. But the reality is that stress can build over time, and we can actually get acclimated to it. And an analogy that one of our contributing authors likes to use when it comes to allostatic load is that trying to heat your home in the winter. And if you keep the door open where you have real winters, not like here in Seattle, the furnace is going to kick in, and it's going to kick in hard to keep the temperature about the same. But after a while, that furnace is going to burn out because it is working way too hard to maintain a 68, 70 degree temperature in a home that has the doors and the windows wide open. And we see the same thing with stress in the game industry. Burnout has been a buzzword, a topic of concern. But the same thing with crunch, and the fact that when crunch is utilized in game studios, roughly 1 out of 6 devs are working more than 70 hours a week, and that's problematic. And so, it's a huge.
Yeah, I think I want to also, we take pains to distinguish between long-term cultural crunch and short-term pre-release crunch. There are times in any industry where it's all hands on deck. You're going to work some extra hours, say in the 2 to 3 weeks before a game comes out. In the nonprofit industry, in the 2 weeks before an event happens. Those kinds of things, they're not great, but they're short term, and you can plan for them and then make up for them. The real challenge that we're talking about, and the real concern we have, is long term, ongoing crunch that is part of the culture in a given company. And that's a really common feature of game companies and game work that relates to the idea of passion and why we come to this work. And it's a really important distinction in this conversation.
Yeah, and it overlaps with passion. Like, people think crunch means you're passionate, but it also, we mentioned the white paper, it has become a cultural phenomenon to the sense where, well, if you're unwilling to do it, you must not love what you do enough, and then you shouldn't be in this industry. And that is a completely unhealthy way to look at exacerbated stress over the long period of time.
Well, with the amount of stress that these companies put on their employees, it oftentimes is puzzling to me. One of the presidential candidates that I really like talks about how just the stress of having a bill you can't pay drops your IQ down a standard deviation. So stress weighs on our brain activity and things like that. So how do these companies justify putting that enormous stress, knowing that their workers aren't going to be able to, this is a very intellectual field. So if you're going down a standard IQ deviation just from not being able to pay an electric bill, I can only imagine the amount of brain power you're losing from working, 80-hour, 16-hour days. How do they quantify that as productive?
Let's be. I want to be real clear on one thing, that oftentimes it's not companies being malicious. Okay, there is a culture of passion that exists industry wide within the game industry, and it often starts from the top. And you've got people who are genuinely enthusiastic about games, and they just want to make games, and they get focused on making games. And most companies that we encounter aren't directly saying you have to do this or you're canned. There is a subtle culture of passion, and people follow the examples of their managers to the point that a substantial chunk of the game industry reports that unspoken crunch is expected.
To piggyback on that, Dr. B, because you said it so well, I'd like to kind of take a historical look at the industry. The industry, while not brand new, is not that old. It hasn't fully matured. And in the early days, you had a lot of small studios and small groups of very passionate people setting their own agenda and making their own game and getting really excited about it. And it's turned into a massive business. It is huge. I mean, it is bigger than all, like television media companies combined at this point, right? It is, and so it has turned from a small grassroots passion-driven industry into a large corporate kind of exploitative industry over time. And that creates conditions where people feel compelled and stuck in terms of their work. But the culture, the idea of passion and the kind of metaphors that the industry uses and the way it understands how to manage game production have barely changed. There are differences. There are exceptions to this rule. Not every studio crunches. Not every company works this way. There are labor laws across different companies and different countries that create and necessitate different working environments. But there is overall this idea, even among people who say, oh yeah, crunch is awful. They'll say, but if you really press them, they'll say, but it's really hard to do a game without crunch. Yeah. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up the fact that this culture has existed. So after reading the white paper, actually last week I finished a book by Blake J. Harris, Console Wars, which I don't know if any of you read it, but it's all about Nintendo and Sega and their adversarial relationship in the late 80s and 90s and how they came about. And while I was reading it, because again, I read that book after the white paper, I'm thinking the whole time, well, this is all crunch. This is all like what they do, that adversarial nature that the consoles have had, that the game developers have had, kind of have driven towards these really strategic release dates and firm deadlines with these that they put then the weight on the lower employees and the developers to hit. In that book, it highlights even in the early 90s, they're just telling the game developers, no, you will release by November 15th. Like that's happening. You're gonna we before we talked to the game developers, we scheduled Sonic Saturday, and we're releasing the game on Sonic Saturday, and you're gonna hit that day, and it causes this top down culture. And then Dr. B, you talk about how it's not even just kind of top down; it's also grassroots, bottom up culture. That hey, it's almost like lower level hazing that. Hey, it's expected. You come into the community and you are expected to work this level. Otherwise, you're not really dedicated to be in this profession in the first place.
Well, and so I'll give the grassroots perspective. When I saw clients regularly in a practice in the Seattle area, I saw a lot of students, game developer students, et cetera, and they talked in almost a romanticized notion, not in an exploitative fashion, but this almost romanticized notion of the idea of, like, think of Steve Jobs and, the early days of Apple and Windows, guys in their garage working diligently into the night, coming up with a breakthrough product. And that, you mentioned a hazing ritual, but that was the lens through which they saw it, this romantic, I'm going to work long hours and I'm going to have a breakthrough. And if I work long and hard enough, I will make a difference. I will be the next Steve Jobs. I will be the next, Paul Allen, Bill Gates. And they were carrying that through. And their instructors were often encouraging this romantic notion. And it carries through into the industry when they work.
Yeah, and hazing can be a harsh word, but when framed kind of romantically, hazing turns into just paying your dues or initiation or passion. It can be kind of framed or looked at depending on who's applying the pressure and where that person's mindset is, who's receiving it.
And you guys had mentioned that, every country has different laws and, a lot of these game studios are in foreign countries and things like that. What I found, I'm in the construction industry and I've worked with immigrants who came from Europe and other countries to work on job sites. And the one thing that they have all said to me is that Americans are crazy. Like, we work crazy hours, crazy hard, more than like anything in their experience. I worked with an Irishman for a long time, and he said that, you Americans just will constantly work to get stuff, to buy things and have things. And the mindset in Europe is, they want holiday, so they don't want to work 3 months out of the year. They want to take holidays. So they value their work time a lot differently. Do you find that crunch is a cultural thing, specific to region, or is it, across the board, every company kind of does it despite, culture backgrounds?
There are definitely cultural differences across different parts of the game industry, but crunch is a frequent feature despite that. There are many, many small studios that have agreements and policies in place around, especially in Scandinavia, around 6-hour workdays and how people contact each other or don't outside of work hours, and how that's reinforced and stuff. And those are really cool and notable exceptions. I think the thing that's interesting that I've had conversations with folks in the industry about is that outside of the U.S., the other parts of the white paper seem more relevant. Issues around diversity and and inclusion, which aren't great here, but can be even worse. For example, in Europe, and with some real notable examples recently. So I think it's a really nuanced discussion, and I want to make sure that we don't sit on the topic of crunch, because the incidence of crunch has actually improved or decreased. The incidence of crunch has decreased in the industry over the last 10 to 12 years. And that is definitely the case. And there's a different idea around it. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been some really high profile examples of it in the last 18 months, with major stories about Rockstar and BioWare, but the other aspects of what's going on in the industry that are a threat to mental health are in some ways more insidious and harder to solve.
So before we leave crunch, though, I do have a question. So is it regulations, like the government's job to try to stop this? So we have laws, against truck drivers driving a certain amount of times on the road. And we actually have, mechanical boxes installed in these trucks that literally shut the engine down after a certain amount of time and stop these people just for road safety reasons, truck driver health reasons, things like that. Do you feel it's the government's job to take this on, or is it something that workers and developers should be handling internally for the sake of employees and profitability?
So that's a complex and loaded question, and the way I will answer is to provide you with some different potential approaches and things that are happening. One of the things that can improve working conditions is, in fact, stronger labor laws. Absolutely. And they are weaker here than in many other places. There is also an organizing effort and a unionization effort across the industry that's gaining steam. It's gaining more steam outside of the U.S. than here, but that is a solution that folks in the industry are talking about. We often compare ourselves to the entertainment industry. The entertainment industry is heavily unionized and the game industry is not. So, and the voice actors in the industry are, right? Because they're part of, usually SAG-AFTRA. So it's an interesting thing to see where that goes. There are also efforts to just change company culture, to do work training. And some of this we're involved in is to look at what's going on now in the industry and try to work with members of the industry, try to change policies, try to identify the biggest pain points. And probably the answer is somewhere in a combination of all of these efforts, because some of this stuff is not going to just disappear. It's hard to change company culture.
Although I would love it if we adopted the 6-hour workday.
Yeah.
All industries. That'd be great.
Yeah, I've been petitioning really cool for siestas.
Bless you.
For a long time.
Let's all just head out in the afternoon,
right?
Sangria, and
I've taken up meditation as of late. Like I could definitely do for a 12:30 meditation break, regulated. That's fine with me.
Well, on the unionizing front, I don't know if any of you saw just on Sunday the show with Patriot Act. With Samanaj on Netflix, he went into pretty good depth on crunch specifically, and then the unionizing efforts as maybe a solution to it. So hopefully that is gaining some steam. And then, like you said, it really does drive to culture, and culture is such a insidious thing to correct. It's very hard to course correct culture that has existed for a long time, and it just takes some retraining and education. I'm a big fan
of the show *Halt and Catch Fire*, and you could see since the 80s, it's been this. I went on a 16-hour coding session, and it's something that they brag about. It's something that they wear as a badge of honor. That I stayed up for 26 hours coding and I wrote this phenomenal code, and it's going to be kind of hard to break that mindset given the fact that it's been like that now for almost 40 years.
It is, but one of the things that I wish got more attention in the media is some of the more subtle efforts of a lot of different studios. there are a lot of different studio executives who come to us who want to change that culture. I mean, really, to their credit, they want to change it. That's part of the reason that Take This exists, is they come to us, what can we do to improve the mental health? What can we do to improve the organization of my studio and industry wide? But as we were talking about earlier, you've got this basically two-pronged thing. You've got, this grassroots romanticized notion of exactly what you said. I've been coding for 60 hours. I did this marathon thing and I'm going to make a breakthrough. Meanwhile, I can't see straight. And financial pressures and all of that. So it's going to take a while. There's no one magic solution. If there is, this would be a very different conversation.
Well, to transition from crunch and talk about some of those other topics that the white paper really goes into, and the next main one really was instability, and you even cited one of the studies in your white paper that states that frequent job changing has also been associated with health risk benefit or behaviors such as smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, physical inactivity. That just the instability, the frequent job changing is detrimental to overall health, mental and physical health. And how is that instability kind of perpetuated in the gaming industry?
So the industry is cyclical and hit-based. So games cycle up with huge staffs and huge teams to do the development, right? And then a game is released and boom, half of those people are not needed anymore. Now that is slightly different now with episodic games and narrative games that have ongoing content released over time, where there's a heavy load on an ongoing basis that is a different set of stressors, right? We'll go into that separately. But so when you get a really uneven development cycle, it's oftentimes people anticipate or expect to be laid off as soon as a game is released or shortly before a game is released. Like, hey, thanks for your work. We'll see you later. Bye.
Yeah.
And there are company structures that try to avoid that, but that's a really common thing.
Yeah, reading the paper, it seems like it almost is like a freelance situation, but they're not freelancers. They don't have a contract that they know will expire. So they have this impending doom of, will they be one of the 50% to be retained or one of the 50% that are fired? And they don't, and that lack of kind of contractual knowledge of knowing that you're going into this for only a set period of time, I imagine does add a significant amount of stress and difficulty in the industry.
Yeah. And there's heavy use of contractors in the industry too. And that's often, the people are often dangled with the opportunity of, well, if you do well on this contract, you'll get hired. And that doesn't really seem to pan out. And,
right.
And so there's a lot of complexity, and a lot of it is business planning and decision making. A lot of it is like the structure of how companies plan for and release games. And a lot of it is the uncertainty of a creative industry. Games are often delayed. Releases sometimes don't go well. What happens then? How do companies plan for or try to shore up against potential failure or less than stellar releases? And a lot of those mechanisms either aren't implemented very frequently or just people assume that it's not possible, it's not feasible.
So I often see this analogous to my field, the construction industry, and the one thing that keeps it vibrant is a strong union. So you start building a building, everybody's got tons of jobs, it's all hands on deck, you're putting up a skyscraper, but as the building starts to wind down, people get laid off, companies aren't needed, you start laying it off. But that's what the union's there for, to take that small section and implement them in the next building that's going up or this and that. So, I mean, honestly, do you see if the workers are able to structure a strong union, this problem kind of not necessarily going away, but definitely, I mean, it's got to be not the overall answer, but the major answer for some of these problems, right?
Well, it's certainly an answer. Whether it is the overall answer remains to be seen. Because I have a lot of friends who have done construction as well, and just what happens when there's no projects?
Well, and that's the thing, is that the video game industry, like we said, is dwarfing all of the entertainment industries combined. So the belief that there's a lack of projects is kind of hard to weigh in on.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. We need structures in place to stabilize and to help people manage those transitions. There are some companies, some of the larger companies that are not based in the U.S. that have managed to create pools of workers at the end of a project, and that's kind of the kind of standard. You go off a project and you go into this pool, and then you're kind of available for the next thing. And that's an internal structure that works really well, right? So that the people can transition into new projects. But it only works when a company has the capacity to be doing multiple projects at a time. And many game companies are a one trick pony, or one thing at a time structure. And that there's a lot of danger and a lot of risk associated with that. Also, I think there's a couple of things. One, it's a very geographically.
That was going to be my next question, is how does borders and of having different nations and languages also kind of contribute to this problem?
I think the hardest thing that even in say the US Canada geographic area, right? You've got developers all over the place, and people often will be able to find a job, but it means uprooting themselves, their whole family, etc. And because we have moved from an industry that was small and grassroots and often young to an industry that is so large and has many people who've been in it for a while, people now have families, they have lives. Uprooting themselves to go get another good job is really stressful and detrimental. And so it's in part because it's so geographically diverse, in part because there are specializations at the top of the field that are harder for people to find work in than in other parts of the field, that it's really complex. But there are definitely, absolutely structures that can be put in place to kind of undergird and provide stability and create a greater sense of security for people. I will also say this is a good moment to check in about the difference between what we call AAA studios and even mid-sized studios and indies. And for people who don't know, indie developers are independent developers who often have very small studios. Some are, one person.
Yeah.
Some are, 20. And the challenges for indie developers are really different than the challenges for AAA studios and the people who work for them.
And I guess that does pose a question as far as so these smaller developers that don't have the budget, they don't have the ability to have a pool of individuals that are not actively engaged in productive work, and they don't have the ability to do this. Well, where do all those employees go then at the end of their major project? And what is kind of that solution? What I don't want to see is, the big companies just buying up all these small companies because they're no longer viable because unionization or something like that forces them to maintain a staff that is not supportable. So really, where does that correction come? Because some of it cannot be managed at, again, those smaller studio levels.
Yeah, there's absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. There are a couple of things. I mean, we're talking to a couple of networks of indie developers about how do we help indie devs access business training and negotiation training, kind of MBA 101 stuff that will help them create more stability. My husband has an MBA, and he's been able to maintain an 18-person company for 10 years by really skilled negotiation and deal making. They've never had a major hit of a game, and they're still around. And that is in and of itself kind of a success story, right? But that's not everybody's skill, and it's not everybody's understanding of how to run a game company, right? Or their focus. And so it's really important that we start to talk about different models. We start to give people examples of what's possible and provide a lot of support and training. At the indie level, it really is, it's often a few people working out of their houses, and the dynamics are really different. And most of those studios are never going to get funded by VC money. They're never going to get, bought by a major studio. And so they need a lot of support.
Now, for those that lack the understanding of exactly how the companies work in-house and things like that, is this something that a lot of these jobs can be done remotely? I mean, it's, having to uproot people so they can work in the studio that the game is being developed. Do you lose anything from having, 10 of your coders being in 10 different cities across 2 different countries? Is there a creative aspect that is lost by doing that? Is it not necessarily possible for that to be? Because it seems like, we are moving more and more towards a workforce that is able to work remotely due to, especially once 5G comes into play and a lot of technology has assisted this. It seems like we should be kind of phasing that problem out just due to, societal advancements. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Well, I mean, yes and no. Oh, sorry. Please, Rachel.
I was going to say, I think yes and no is what I was going to say, Dr. So my husband works in tech, not in game development, but programming, software development. And every company is different. So some companies he's worked completely remotely. We lived in Germany. He worked at a company in California, and he logged in every day, and it was fine. But his current position, they really encourage you to come in and not work remotely to form the camaraderie.
Yeah, you hear a lot of studios want to develop a culture, like they have a culture they want to instill.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it does make a difference to be in the same room. I mean, I want to make a fun analogy with Dungeons and Dragons.
I was thinking the same thing. I know where you're going with this.
You do.
And this is why we're all on the Nerd Cantina.
So I play Dungeons and Dragons with a group of individuals on Twitch, and I am here in my house in Canada, and other members are together in a room. And the vibe and banter and group dynamic is completely different with the individuals in the room together, being creative, bouncing ideas off each other, interacting with each other, just from the nature of being physically close. And yes, Dr. B is one of the people in the room with the other people.
We've the three of us in the same room have developed like Dr. Cowart's saying that just the dynamic is very different. The three of us in that room, I mean, yes, all three of us also have a bit of an acting background, and we're used to playing off of each other, but the lack of delay, the lack of distance, we've started referring to ourselves as the Three Stooges. Because of the dynamic we've just taken on. And certainly studios can do the same thing where even at Take This. When Take This was first started 7 years ago almost, everybody was remote. But over time, actually, Dr. Cowart's really is the only director who's not in the Seattle area. And
shots fired.
I'm going to tease her about this incessantly. But just the working dynamic has changed with the ability to have Eve, our operations director, Katrina Keller, and me all in the same room. And even some of our program managers are in Seattle. It's just a different vibe. On top of that, if we want to bring this back to the studio example, there are studios who are doing highly classified R&D, research and development. And do they want the security risks of having people remote? Let's say you're doing a highly classified game, and that creates a different dynamic as well. And so that's why, once again, I mean, if there was a monolithic, easy solution, somebody would have come up with it by now.
But I do also want to say the point of this white paper, and Eve can talk more about this, was to start this conversation. And we are moving forward with working groups, with representatives from studios to try and pinpoint what are these solutions? Because it's not just one thing. And it varies across, as we mentioned, studio sizes and locations and projects. So we're really happy to be talking about all of this. But hopefully...
And that's why we wanted to have you guys on the show also, is this is something consumers of video games should care about. You don't want to buy the next Madden knowing that you put 7 people in the hospital to do so. You know, I mean, these are things that consumers should also be caring about. You know, I don't necessarily want to buy a game knowing that I put somebody's family at risk, somebody's health at risk, that I would feel a lot better with my $59.99 purchase knowing that, you know, it supported proper work standards and things like that. So that is also, you know, a reason why we wanted to have this conversation too.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think Rachel makes a really good point that part of why we did this is because we don't know what the solutions are. We need to talk about them. And the idea of ethical consumption, you know, it existed. We have tried it before around sweatshops, right? And clothing production and other things. And there's boycotts of companies all the time. And I would like to think that we could change consumption patterns broadly across the game industry. It's a massive industry with many, many different demographics consuming games and participating in games. And so that's certainly a tactic we can use, but it's not one that I think can exist in a vacuum, right? I don't think it's the only solution.
Well, the larger the industry, it's harder to kind of police these things.
Yeah.
So you see these situations rampant in like the food industry because everybody eats food, the clothing industry because everybody wears clothes. And we are almost at a point in society where damn near everybody plays video games, you know, so it like you said, it's not just a problem of this industry, but it's a problem of scaling almost, right? I mean, how do we keep ethics in our mind while scaling on a proportion that is almost unimaginable to the human mind?
Yeah. And I think it's really, as we keep coming back to, it's both and. It's going to be a huge combination of things that are both external and internal forces that allow the game industry to see itself differently.
So how do we incentivize consumers and companies to care more about this? You know, we're starting the conversation. We're having the conversation. We bring it to the forefront. At some point, we need, you know, incentives for these major corporations that are just profit driven to care about these things. And then also consumers who just, I want my game as fast as I can get it and I want it as cheap as I can buy it. You know, these are two major thought, you know, processes that are major hurdles that if any of these problems are going to be fixed are going to need to be leaped over. So how do we start to kind of tie incentives into these things?
And Steve, you brought up, the fact that you said you've got consumers who are, you know, chomping at the bit. Yes, Dr. B is nodding. We are really concerned with online harassment of game makers by the game community, and that we'll get to that. Obviously, I know you know that because you read the paper, but.
Well, we can go there now. As the harassment that you talk about, both the social media aspect in your white paper. Please let's go ahead and transition there now.
Okay, I mean, because I want to say that like there are a lot of companies that understand that these practices and these approaches are bad. There's a lot of people who don't have tools or can't imagine another way, and there are a lot of people that also are trying to imagine another way. I mean, that really is, you know, there really is movement on this. It's just in fits and starts. And so we've tried to gather some data that can focus the problem and focus our attention. And hopefully that's like a necessary but insufficient first step, right? But in terms of online harassment, game devs are and game companies are kind of scared right now. They're scared of the online mob. And it's not that online game communities, well, we don't know. They're not, and this is interesting research that Dr. Coates gonna work on, hopefully. They're not like measurably, we don't think, different from the rest of the internet, which has a mob mentality too. It manifests in real abuse of people who make games, and it's awful. Like, these are real people who are human and try things and make mistakes, or it takes longer to do something than you thought, or, you know, there's some licensing deal in the back end that nobody knows about that creates, you know, conditions for X, Y, and Z not to happen. And there's no forgiveness. There's no.
Yeah, I watch E3 religiously every year, and you see these developers walking out on stage scared for their lives at times. The Fallout 76 guys should have came out crawling on their hands and knees and begging for their fans to just give us time to make the game better, please, because it's been brutal for them, and you can be sympathetic to them, because you know the overall shareholders, you know, are mostly profit driven, but these heads of the studios and the people that work at these studios, I honestly believe they want to just put out a good game. You know, it's like an author or a songwriter. You just want your content positively received. You're putting it out there in the world. You're very vulnerable when you do that. And yeah, the internet's a brutal place. And I do oftentimes, you know, have a lot of empathy for their position.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are not a lot of tools. There's not a lot of good models or tools out there for game companies or game makers to figure out how to respond or deal with this stuff. I mean, it happens all the time. It happens with major releases and small indie releases as well. I was just one a couple of weeks ago, Ooblets, that came out. That they just received this awful storm of abuse out of the blue. From people who weren't even interested in the game to begin with. And so it relates a little bit quite a lot to the seedier and scarier sides of the internet that have nothing to do with games, but have been associated with that community.
Well, I can even admit myself, I've been at fault of that at times. I mean, when Destiny released, I went off on a bunch of tangents. I may have even mentioned it on this podcast a few times, because they were trying to hit a goal. They were trying to revolutionize MMOs for consoles. They had writers quit. They needed to hit a certain target date, and they pushed out a game that wasn't ready. It wasn't ready for consumption. But that pressure of, you know, we've been waiting 3 years. You guys have been talking about this game for 3 years. When am I going to get to play it? When am I going to get to play it? They pushed out a product that was half done, that was pieced together. You know, like I said, they had writers quit, so they just kind of like hodgepodge the story together. And yeah, as a consumer, I was furious, because I love MMOs. I'm a console guy, not a PC guy. So to have an MMO that I could play on my Xbox was really exciting to me. And then also the same thing recently with Anthem. You know, you have a big failure that came out with Anthem, that these developers are feeling a lot of pressure to hit certain target dates, and it's either push it back, and then the minute they push that date back, they just get a ton of negative press, or push out a game that is buggy and half finished, and then you have fans complaining about, you know, I have to pay for a DLC that should have been included in the original game. You see they're trying to play the game, and we're not really making it fair for them.
And what you highlight is, you know, the internet has a great knack at just dehumanizing the people. It's not just at the studios. Then it starts to target the individuals who created the games, the individuals who are associated with it, and then they start to become the subject of mass kind of targeting and harassment.
Oh yeah,
online.
to me, Bungie's faceless. So when I go off on my Bungie rants and things like that, you don't associate 100 coders reading this horrible tweet and just feeling demoralized because they spent 16-hour days trying to get this game ready, and yeah, it's a very toxic situation.
Taking it back to when I had a practice and I worked with people individually, one of the things that really surprised a lot of the often teenagers I worked with a lot of teenagers, that it is how small the industry is and how it in fact isn't faceless. So they would bring up a rant about a game, pick any game. Actually, well, let's talk about Destiny and Bungie, because my office was not far from Bungie Studios.
I'd have been throwing rocks.
What's that?
I said I'd have been throwing rocks.
well, no, and so when some of the teenagers I was working with just go on these rants about a given studio, let's say Bungie, and I just casually say, "Oh, I know a bunch of people there." Their faces change. And they're like, wait a minute, this isn't just a mega corporation with 1,500 people there. No, I'm like, these are friends of mine. And the human factor changes the conversation, that it's it's no longer an anonymous corporation. It's filled with people, and the tone softens. And we're able to have,
I was saying, it only humanizes it because you were a human in front of them. If you tell them on Twitter, I know people who work there, well, it doesn't matter. Now you're going to get bashed because you're still faceless. You're still dehumanized in that medium.
But what some of the kids I worked with told me is that their online behavior started to change as well. And their parents actually told me that as well, that if we can, however, humanize the industry and make this about the people who did it. You know what a great example of this recently was? And it wasn't actually the game industry directly. It was the Sonic the Hedgehog.
we talked about that on the podcast a few times.
Yeah. And so, there was an outcry at the design of Sonic, and the studio heads, in response to the fan outcry, were like, hey, we're going to redesign it. And then people were like, wait a minute, what are you going to do to the animators and the FX people to make them redesign this entire movie to get it out on time? And the studio, to their credit, said, you know what? We care about our people. We're going to push it back. And there were complainers, but a lot of people were like, hey, good on you. Way to meet our needs and take care of your people.
Mm-hmm. I think an important point, just to loop it back slightly to how you said crunch lowers your IQ, a standard deviation. I think humanizing can even start just from this conversation of the people who make this game work 70 hours a week. And Anthem is a perfect example of how if you push and push and push and push to meet your deadline, your employees are not as productive, your employees are not as happy, the final product is not received well, and then it loops into this cycle of, oh, now you're harassed on Twitter, and then you react because you're stressed and tired and no one liked your game, and then you get fired because you reacted in a way that was inappropriate, and it's just like this whole cesspool of nothing good when it's supposed to be, we're making games and games are fun and they're supposed to bring joy. And
I think it's really significant that it's really important that we humanize games and game makers, and that we talk. There's a culture of secrecy in game development, especially for large IPs, because it's large game titles and stuff. There's you want a surprise, you want to make a big media announcement, you don't want the fits and starts of development necessarily to be laid bare. On the other hand, the more we talk about and are clear about what is involved in making a game, which is extraordinarily complex, especially as graphics are more advanced and our expectations about the size and experience of the game, the length of it, the complexity of it, our ability to be engaged.
I want 4K graphics, no load screens. I want
that takes real work. And so we have to talk about that. Even if it's in general terms, we have to be really clear that people make games and they will continue to make games. It is a creative enterprise.
So is not one of the answers like a PR campaign that the industry as a whole needs to kind of spearhead, the EAs, the BioWares, the Bungies, everybody chip in a few bucks, not just wheel out the dispensers on the stage of E3, but actually fill the stage with 50 programmers, get people to actually see the faces at E3 of the people who are making these games. Because the two major heads are on that stage, but there's still 150 coders back at the headquarters crunching right now. Give them the day off. Let them come to E3 with you. Put them on the stage. Let's all see some faces. These are major problems, and it's I'm just trying to spitball ideas on how we can be proactive in these things so that like I said, these aren't problems I want to support with my dollars, as a consumer.
I have a fantasy solution that I would love to see. It's totally not going to happen. It's really not reasonable, but it's my fantasy that I would take a lot of the trolls from Twitter and I would give them an internship in a AAA studio or an indie studio and just make them code for a week. And to see, I can just imagine this, but this would be easy to do, to port your game to another console.
Yeah, if we could take internet trolls and make them live in the situations they complain about, I think that would solve 98% of the world's problems, not just the gaming industry.
Yeah.
But this is my fantasy. Of course, it can't happen, but this is my fantasy.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of time, I want to ensure that we do talk about something that we hinted at earlier, but another big topic in the white paper, and that's moving into inclusiveness, diversity in the gaming industry as part of the state industry. The paper, I think it comes right off the bat with what's probably no surprise, that the industry is full of white men, right? As far as employees, I don't think anybody should be surprised to find that stat. But then, really, what is the driving cause, and really how dangerous is this to the industry?
So in this way,
loaded questions. That's all you get here.
Loaded questions.
Thanks. So my short answer is that the game industry is not divorced from our larger cultural context.
Right.
However, it is also a magnification of it for a lot of historical and structural reasons around how the game industry developed and who was involved in coding and stuff, and how games were marketed, especially in the 80s and 90s.
And you talk about in the paper that core gamer model and who was both targeted, but then that also became kind of like the hiring model as well, and that being the core gamer of 18 to 34-year-old white men.
And that's an insidious idea that exists in a lot of people's lives and a lot of people's minds of like, oh, this is who I am and this is my space. And it is not unrelated, as we note in the white paper, to online harassment. That much of the worst harassment is directed at women and people of color and non-binary folks, and that's really awful. There's a couple of layers to it. One is around harassment and online treatment of people, and that's one side of it. There's also what happens inside game companies. There needs to be a Me Too moment in the game industry. It hasn't happened yet, in part because I think there aren't, unlike the entertainment industry or in politics, there aren't really like famous, well-known names. And so it can't make the same big media splash then brings people out of the woodwork and holds people accountable. But there's awful stuff and people who have been protected across the industry for a long time who are very abusive and create toxic cultures in the industry. There's been some press around this recently, but not enough. It's insufficient. And also, the reason why we care, right, is that more diverse teams make better games. More diverse teams make more diverse games, which bring a larger audience to games, which is good for the industry, which then creates space for different ideas in different spaces and different ways of talking about and being in the community. And it's so important that we have as much diversity in the game industry as possible.
Now, is there challenges to achieving that diversity in the sense that computerscience.org publishes how many people are achieving bachelor's degrees in say, computer science? And their latest statistics is that still only 18% of bachelor's degrees given for computer science are women. And then when you look at racial diversity, 38% of them are white, 36% are East Asian, 10% South Asian. So really, you're looking at between white and Asians, the vast majority race-wise, and then it's still women are only achieving computer science degrees that interest level at the bachelor level so low. Does it make it a challenge because the job pool of qualified candidates is also not diverse? And how do we? I guess this comes down to STEM education and everything else at younger ages, but it's really a challenge for the industry, I'm sure, now to step this up.
It's a challenge for sure in terms of the pool they're starting with. I mean, is definitely less diverse than one would hope, but it's also a challenge that when they do hire people that don't fit into that mold of cisgender white male,
right,
they're not treating them the same, and they're not having the same opportunities, and they are going to work and being harassed and mistreated. So that's not going to even further encourage individuals from this mold to enter into the field. And it's not just games, like you mentioned, computer science. These kinds of stereotypes and stuff really prevail in a lot of different technology-focused areas. But with games, it's very well documented that women and people of color and non-binary folks are treated disproportionately different from their peers.
With multiple game studios in multiple countries, as we had discussed, do we find that certain regions are a lot better at this than others? And what are those regions doing differently than what we're doing here at home or anywhere else abroad? Are there things that we can pull from what other countries are doing as far as maybe, like you said, STEM education or anything like that is making, say, a studio in Norway more diverse and inclusive than a studio here at the U.S.?
I actually would say that the U.S. may be ahead of other places in diversity.
Oh, really?
Actually, when it comes to diversity.
That's bleak.
That's actually a scary thought.
I think there is no easy solution here. Best things that can happen, that women are given good, consistent mentorship when they enter, that they become visible in leadership roles. They are given access to leadership roles. And once they are visible in leadership roles, they serve both as, and I'm saying women, but it's also people of color. It's anyone who is not a white male is given space to be supported, to gain access to leadership roles, is given leadership roles, and then is visible in them. Because once a diversity of people are in leadership roles, they create a path. They open an idea of what's possible, and they also often hire more diverse candidates. And that's a really hard won, slow process. And it's not unique to the game industry. When we see this need across tech, we see this need across many industries. But, there are many very, very skilled, very, very smart women leading studios already. They're just not given the kind of hero worship, the kind of access to capital, the kind of access to attention and press that other people are, that white men are.
And do you feel that's directly related to interest at the younger age? So the fact that young women aren't seeing their mentors in a forefront, that they don't have as much interest in pursuing these fields because they feel they are it's almost a dead end road for them? Or is it more just kind of basic than that? Yeah,
people of color often will look for safe spaces, right? Because it is exhausting to work in a space that's not safe. And so they're going to look for leadership that looks like them, and places that have kind of shown that they are available and safe and open to them. And if they don't see those, they're going to be really careful. because there can be some really awful consequences for their own mental and physical health and safety. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Because you like I said, you could definitely see why a young woman or a young minority person might not be interested in entering the field just because they don't see anybody like them at an E3 stage or, presented, totally. I'm trying to gauge how much of this is just a cultural problem. A lot of women go into the nursing fields and the teaching fields, due to, just how they view their role in society and things like that. That if we're perpetuating these role stereotypes by not having, an inclusive, like you said, higher level of studio heads and things like that in the forefront so that they can see, oh, that girl looks just like me. She's on an E3 stage. I would like to be on an E3 stage one day. I'm going to go into computer sciences.
Or I could work with that woman, or I could work with that man who's Black because I look like him and I bet he's going to be good to me or like support me. But it's also, so it is the responsibility of people who are already in leadership and positions of power and who have access to money to create explicit pathways for a more diverse group of people to gain access to leadership, capital, and opportunity and exposure. And that means it's not just one person, right? It's not the token Black guy. It's not the token gay man. It is the 10 female studio heads. It is the 5 emerging leaders in let's talk about geographic, diversity. The 5 emerging game makers in India or Sri Lanka, because we rely on contract labor in certain places. And so we have ideas about who is worthy of doing the real work and who's worthy of doing the contract work, right? And they are at different levels. And so all of these narratives we need to explicitly change, and that has to come from the top.
And one of the things, not jumping a little bit out of the industry itself, but into the way that games portray diversity, one of the common arguments we hear is that, well, there's no market. That is objectively false. There was a really great and we cited this in the white paper. There was a really great survey done by EA, and of several thousand people that they surveyed, and what they found was roughly only 1 in 7 people thought that there was enough diversity and representation in games. That means 80, based on their statistics, 6 out of 7 people are at least neutral. If not, they want more. And that is going to spurn it forward too. One of my nieces, the instant she saw a female protagonist, you can't get her to stop talking about wanting to be a coder now.
Yeah, and that's where I, as a father of 2 daughters, I love the Tomb Raiders. The fact that my daughter can play a Tomb Raider one day and feel like this is me. I can do this if I want. And as a cis white male, I don't feel emasculated when I play a Tomb Raider. I don't feel like, I wish that, that this game had a big burly white man as a main character that I could play. I feel like
we got enough of those.
Yeah. You know what I mean? I don't, that thought never crosses my mind when playing, a Tomb Raider, game like that, so yeah, as a father with 2 daughters, I want them to feel included in things like that. And I don't feel that the main, I don't know if it's anecdotal to me, but yeah, I don't feel the general public is going to feel like they lost anything by playing more Black protagonists, more female protagonists, more,
And it goes back to something you said earlier in a quote in the white paper, that building a diverse team is putting a game first. It's putting the game first. It puts the industry first. The more diverse the games, the more diverse the audience, which down line maybe becomes a more diverse interest in the communities in the field. So achieving that diversity now sooner than later, both in diverse games and diversity in the culture, will just kind of perpetuate further diversity and make the community stronger as a whole. Now, to be respectful of your time, I know that we wanted to talk at the end of the white paper. We've got you talk about some of the public perceptions, which is really what we covered, Dr. Court, when you last were on. And for anybody who wants to listen to that, you can go to thenerdcantina.com/show10 to find that episode. But some of the recent news that we did want to just kind of get your opinion, because there's been some significant attacks against the game industry when we talk about perceptions, and that ties back into the violence with the mass shootings in both El Paso and Dayton. And essentially, you have the president blaming it on violence. You have other people then signing off and taking those old tropes of violence in video games causes people to become violent. Walmart then pulls violent video games, violent video game displays out of their store, which means the biggest seller of video games in the country then just signals to the average shopper that there's truth to it. Whether there is or isn't, the average person's not going to go read a study. They're going to just see these signals and they're going to buy it. What are your thoughts on kind of this direction that these perceptions continue to happen?
Well,
buckle up.
I will be as not opposite of long-winded, as concise as possible. The moral panics will continue about video games because people want easy solutions to complex problems. That's the first issue. People see that a piece of media has violent content, and they make the assumption, and it's understandable that people would make this assumption that they are consuming something that looks violent, and therefore that might translate into behaviors. But let me be perfectly clear. The impact of any media on our behavior of any kind is so small, it's not even measurable when you account for age, previous exposure to violence, personality. When you account for any of these demographic factors, the impact of media, television, video games, movies, Elvis's hips, that was always a concern about my mom's generation.
And I know you did address this on TakeThis.org and tweeted it. So if you want the less concise version, please go to TakeThis.org. There is a post, an article by Dr. Cohort addressing this. But it is a damaging to something that's beloved in our community that actually should bring people together, whether it's violent or not. It still brings people together, and attacks on the community as a whole. We really just wish people would. Yeah, we're
going to try to help out and do our part. We're currently trying to come up with a T-shirt design that incorporates the hashtag video games are not to blame. We want to give a portion of the proceeds to your organization to try to help support what you guys are doing. We really commend you guys for kind of, taking this on. It's not an easy subject to talk about. Like we've the overall theme of this episode now has been, they're not easy answers. There's not one road to take to fix these things.
Yep.
But it is something we all need to be talking about. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry with thousands of employees that are being mistreated, marginalized, and whenever people want to spearhead their whatever cause it is, it seems like this isn't one on the radar. Like how you mentioned, it's when we consume media, it's odd to me that they always go back to video games. Rap music had its day in the 90s for a little while, but nobody blames John Wick for why this stuff happens. Nobody's blaming movie studios for massive violence in our society
anymore.
Yes.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, anymore, because games are just the newest thing. And I'm telling you, 10 years from now, when we're still doing this podcast, of course, we'll be talking about VR and AR doing the same thing. And video games will no longer be like, oh, that's nothing. Now we have a real problem with VR.
Well, and so there, as a recommendation, since you guys are clearly doing your homework and are well read, there's a book called Moral Panic, written by a guy named Stanley Cohen. He's actually the one who basically coined the term moral panic. And the way he describes cycles of morality and the
Yeah.
narrative that's driven. Originally, his book was written about the mods and the rockers in England, which is now kind of laughable. But, we look at the way Dungeons and Dragons was demonized, and no pun intended, given the content, in the 1980s. And then
I know we've had a huge influx of wizards in our society, and I just don't know what to do about these guys.
I've got my wand right back here. It's Rowanwood because according to Harry Potter world, that's the healer's wand.
Dungeons and Dragons is a perfect analogy because I shared this on social media the other day where it was like satanic parents are so disappointed that Dungeons and Dragons is just math and improv, right? And it's the same thing about video games. They're just fun games that are good for identity exploration, and they're good for learning things, and they're good for having good time. That's their point of developing them. It is not contributing to mass violence.
Well, as we touched on the last time we were on, it's a cause and correlation kind of issue. Just because violent people play video games doesn't mean the video games cause violent people. And I think it's really easy just to tie the two together, and
yeah,
it's,
it is.
It's a tough nut to crack.
You're entirely correct, Steve. And I think we do have to acknowledge, right, like we were saying, that there is a kind of element of game culture that this core gamer idea that persists, right? And that core gamer idea gives certain members of the game community the idea that they have possession of the identity of a gamer and the membership in a club. And that has created spaces that are not game spaces, but are related to game spaces that are very toxic, right? And
it's funny you mentioned that. I have a Goomba tattooed on my arm with old school established 1988 and 8-bit written on my forearm, just so everyone knows I'm an OG in this game. I didn't come here post Halo. I've been here since day one. And I specifically tattooed it on my forearm so people know the type of gamer I am. It's funny that you went that direction.
Well, but that's like, but you've been able to own that and more, right? But that's not the case. And it has become a space where you see some evidence of recruitment into white supremacist and alt-right ideology and stuff. And it's not games themselves. It's just that it's the right demographic and the right idea of identity that exists there. And this is research we want to look into. We want to understand it better. But I want to, I don't want to walk away from this being like, the video game community has no relationship to this violence. I want to say that there is no relationship between games themselves and violent behavior, but there are cultural forces at play that exist inside this community that are potentially very problematic.
That is very, yes. Yes.
That's the TLDR.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to take just a second to again say thank you very much for your time. We really enjoyed this conversation and enjoy the work and admire the work that you're doing. As you talk about, you're not, the white paper is not about solutions, but in order for anybody to come up with a solution, we have to have an agreed understanding of a problem. And what you're doing is bringing the problem to the forefront and ensuring that it's at least getting its attention, that we can have these conversations around it. We can ensure that other people hear it. And then maybe down the road, that inspires action towards solution. And I appreciate what you're doing. We will continue to be an advocate of takethis.org.
Yeah, we need to inspire the pioneers of the industry that are going to solve these problems. And the only way to create that inspiration is to bring these problems to people's frontal lobes, have them thinking about this in their car rides on the way to work, and make it some water cooler discussion that people do.
And thank you. It's fun to have a nuanced and complex conversation like this. It's really cool.
Oh yeah, this is a total selfish endeavor for me and my brother. We crave these intellectual conversations. We really do, and it's a truly honor and a pleasure for us to be able to sit down with. You know, I'm an electrician by trade. You know what I mean? I have Star Wars tattooed on my hands. I checked the some college box on the applications. But that, like we said, thanks again, guys, for coming on. We're going to try to help do our part. You know, you guys keep doing the great things that you guys are doing. And every once in a while, maybe we'll all butt heads like this and try to send it out into the ether.
Awesome.
Yeah. And check you out on Clinical Role as if you want to hear them on, go watch them play D&D on Clinical Role channel for YouTube.
Go to watch us play D&D.
Well, thank you again for your time. Appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing where the direction Take This continues to go.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, nerds, for listening to episode 33 of the Nerd Cantina show. We hope that you found this conversation today particularly interesting and informative. Steve and I are going to continue to try to find topics like this that need to be highlighted, things that are affecting the communities that we love and that are maybe a little less known to the general public. We urge you all to go ahead and learn more about this as well as other things that TakeThis.org are doing. We talked today about individuals in the industry, but really TakeThis.org is focusing on video games and mental health, both for those who are working, but also those who are consuming. And there are some significant challenges that we are facing now and we will continue to face. Visit their website at takethis.org. You can follow their tabs to learn how to get involved, whether that's to purchase things off of their Amazon wish list that'll go and support the community, or you can volunteer in a variety of different ways. And as always, Steve and I ask that you take a quick stroll in the internet to subscribe and rate and review our podcast. It'll help us take these conversations to a larger audience, getting greater exposure to some of these important topics. Also, join in the conversations on thenerdcantina.com/community, which will take you to our Facebook group where we're continuing to discuss these things as well as maybe some more lighthearted conversations around nerd culture. But that's it for now. Thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you again next time, nerds. Real quick, we just wanted to mention one of our favorite new apps, which is Podcoin. So assuming that because you're listening to our podcast today, that you happen to be a podcasting nerd. And if you are, I can't see any reason why you wouldn't want to get paid for your time.
I'm a big fan of getting paid to do stuff that I do in my daily routine anyways. I sign up for all the rewards programs possible. And with Podcoin, you actually get paid to listen to podcasts. So every minute that goes by that you're listening to your podcast, you are throwing away potential money.
So go ahead, download Podcoin app on either through iTunes or through the Google Play Store. And when you sign up with the promo code Nerd Cantina.
One word. That'll get you 300 free coins towards your account and get you on your way to earning that first reward from either Amazon gift card, Target gift cards, all kinds of things. You could also donate your coins to your favorite charity that they offer. If you're going to be listening to podcasts anyways, you might as well get some free stuff for doing it. So download the Podcoin app, put in the code the Nerd Cantina, get your free coins, and start earning money while you listen to our show.